What's up, everybody? Welcome back to In Search of Answers, the show where you guys ask me questions and I do my very best to answer them. A reminder, if you would like to ask a question for me to potentially answer here on the show, there's two ways you can do that. One, if you're a patron, you can head over to Patreon, find the listing for this episode over there. There will be a link to a form inside of that posting on Patreon, which you can fill out, and that gets you priority access to having your question answered here on the show. Otherwise, you can just leave a comment here on YouTube. And I will do my best to get to pretty much every question that people ask. I'm trying to do my best to answer as many of them as I can. So we're going to get into some questions here today as well. But first, I want to take a little time to sort of expand a little bit more on what I was talking about last week regarding banning add-ons and why I think that's not really the approach that Blizzard should take to resolve this situation. Because there definitely is very much an issue. I do agree that it feels like, especially at super top end rating, if you're not using add-ons to basically tell you what's going on in a fight at any given moment in time, it does feel like you sort of fall behind. It's kind of necessary to have something that's just keeping you more in the loop of what's happening in those fights. And I do agree with that. However, it's not quite as simple as just quote unquote banning add-ons, right? It's not quite the same as just saying, oh, just ban those add-ons. In fact, a lot of people were saying, well, I don't mind the cosmetic add-ons. I don't mind the add-ons that just change how things look, or the more like quality of life helper add-ons, like, bag add-ons and so on and so forth. What they really don't like, and what everyone, at least from what I was seeing, is sort of talking about here, are the add-ons like DBM, bigwigs, weak auras, those sort of combat add-ons that really change up how you approach the gameplay, or at least facilitate a lot your ability to tell what's going on in a fight and react to things that are going on around you. And Rika, I'm going to call it this comment from Rika because they really sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of the issue with just banning those add-ons. So Rika said, I mostly dislike combat add-ons. General UI stuff I'm fine with. I just don't know exactly where you draw the line from an API perspective to keep them functional. And like I said, therein lies the rub, as it were. This kind of hits the issue directly on the head. Blizzard doesn't really have a way to just straight up ban an add-on, right? Like they don't have, it's not like the Steam marketplace where they can say, okay, this mod is no longer able to be installed. We've pulled it from the marketplace, so you can't get it anymore. And you can't install it anymore. They don't have that sort of ability. Add-ons are just files that you drop in a folder in WoW. And unless they were to just completely from the top down change how add-ons are distributed and added into WoW, which I don't see that happening, they really don't have a way to prevent you from installing an add-on. They can theoretically detect add-ons and say that this add-on, oh, we saw that this person was running this add-on, and so now we'll ban them from the game. And I know that's something that they've occasionally done in the past for like add-ons that were utilized to like help with like direct hacks and stuff, right? Like things that were like automatically allowing you to interrupt certain kicks and or certain spells and so on in PvP, for example. That was something that they've been able to detect that in the past. But the problem with that is it's sort of just an arms race, really. It's the sort of thing where, yeah, sure, they can detect this add-on, but then all it takes is that you change a few things about that add-on, you just reinstall it, you change the name, you change a few of the source files around, and now their detection doesn't work anymore. So that's not really feasible in a long-term capacity either. In fact, that's the sort of thing that would just result in a lot of the top-end guilds going back to hiding their streams and not streaming the World First Race anymore, because they would be more worried about like, oh, we're going to use these add-ons because we want to get this advantage. Like it doesn't take away the ability for them to use that advantage. It just makes it something that they want to be kind of sneaky about. And that's just, they'll just be messy in every single way. And you might say, well, why would they stop streaming this if they didn't want to use this? And there's a whole separate topic to get into about the mindset of the extreme top end raider in that case. Realistically, what would happen is we would go right back to the old days of everyone's hiding their streams all the time because they don't want to accidentally give away an advantage. I don't think that's a path that's worth going down. And just straight up banning them through the EULA as a result is not really a feasible option, especially for a lot of these add-ons that are so widespread and so genuinely just so easily replicated. Because again, these add-ons aren't really doing anything that is out of the ordinary. They're not really doing anything that every other add-on doesn't do. And that's the biggest problem. So historically, how Blizzard has banned add-ons in the past, things like AVR, way back in the day, things like decursive or the like emergency monitor healer add-ons that just let you spam click on one thing to heal whoever needed the most healing at that given moment in time. Way back in the vanilla WoW days on those last two at least. The way that those have been banned in the past is by disabling some portion of the API that was providing them with information that was necessary for that add-on to function, but wasn't used by most other legitimate add-ons. AVR is a great example of this one, just because it's really straightforward and easy to describe. When AVR was banned and AVRE was banned, if you remember, this was back during the Wrath of the Lich King days. There was an add-on that would display things on the ground in game, like it was almost an overlay that looked on the ground in game and said, okay, this explosion is going to happen over here, so there's now a zone over there that says don't stand in this. And if you got close to it, it would like change perspective and everything, so it looked like it was just being directly what's the word I'm looking for? Directly projected onto the game world itself. But the way it had to do that was by doing a whole bunch of like mathematical and like geometrical calculations based on where your camera was looking. So Blizzard went and said, okay, well, we can't really remove the ability for an add-on to do math. That's some real basic stuff. We can't really remove the ability for an add-on to display things. That's also some real basic stuff. But what we can do is remove the ability for an add-on to know which direction the camera is facing. So that's more or less what they did, is they went in and they said, okay, now if you move, as you move around, this add-on no longer knows what exactly you're looking at. This add-on no longer knows exactly where your camera is facing. So these overlays don't work anymore because they can't actually triangulate the position to display this thing on the screen so that it looks like it's part of the environment. Okay. Other examples, the cursive and the emergency monitor from way back in the OG vanilla days that I just mentioned, the way that Blizzard disabled those was by making it so that add-ons during combat could not choose a target for a spell for you. That's also why, like Pally Power, for example, nowadays, Pally Power, even in Classic these days, in Season of Discovery, for example, once you're in combat, you can no longer just right-click on the same icon over and over again to buff your whole raid. You then have to manually cast it on those individual people. That's because what they did was make it so that an add-on could not determine the target of your spell for you or determine what spell to cast for you once you're in game. So that was, or once you're in combat, excuse me. So those are a couple of ways that they've banned add-ons in the past, and they've blocked add-ons by finding things that they just didn't want your add-on to be able to do, that they could then just remove that functionality from the API or block that functionality under certain situations that then didn't really break anything else. The problem is add-ons like DBM, add-ons like WeakOrs, and so on, they aren't doing anything crazy. They aren't doing anything that's more than just show a thing on screen, do some math, maybe play a sound. Like, that's literally all they're doing. So, like, for example, say you have an encounter and every 30 seconds, the boss is going, like, start from the start of the encounter, every 30 seconds, the boss is going to do some sort of raid-wide damage thing. And you want to have the ability for, you're the developer of a boss add-on, and you want to have the ability to announce to players this thing is about to happen. All you need in terms of information to do that is to know that combat has started. This mob is in combat, so therefore you can determine what boss mod to actually load. You need to know, and that's it. That's literally it. That's all you need to know. You need to know that you're in combat with this boss. So when the combat starts, it then just starts a timer. That's just a basic Lua function. And anyone who's spent any time in software development will tell you that banning the ability for a add-on to tell time is a very bad idea. That's not going to work. The ability to have an add-on delay or have any sort of function delay what it's doing by a certain amount of time is pretty much mandatory for the majority of add-ons that exist out there. So that's off the table. Can't ban the ability for add-ons to say in this amount of time do a thing, right? Can't ban the ability to display things on screen, because then that ruins all the cosmetic add-ons that people are saying that they're fine with. You can't, like, if you were to ban the ability for DBM to pop up a little icon with a progress bar next to it, you have also now banned the ability for it to change how your unit frames look, or for it to put a different icon when you're out of combat for whatever other flavor reason that you want to have it, or for it to, like, make your health bars look like the Diablo orbs or whatever. Like, you can't block the ability for an add-on to show things. That doesn't work. And you can't reasonably block the ability for an add-on to know what you're in combat with. Like, there's probably some, like, under the hood things that they could do if they really wanted to, but all that would require is that the add-on developers then have to jump through a couple extra hoops to figure out what you're in combat with, and that wouldn't be that big of a deal regardless. So that's just one example. Other things like Okay, the boss just did this shout in game, which means they're about to cast this spell, or the boss is now casting this spell. Like you could not reasonably block the ability for an add-on to know that a spell is being cast, because again, those cosmetic add-ons, like things that change how your cast bar looks, things that change how your unit frames look, and so on, they need to know that information as well. All of this information is stuff that the cosmetic add-ons need to function, and in some cases, they need it even more than what these add-ons actually require. These combat focused add-ons actually require. So cosmetic action add-ons, in a lot of ways, they're really just calling the same functions that the combat add-ons call. So you can't really realistically block those at an API level. And this, of course, by the way, is not even getting into the concept of accessibility here. Like right now, I'm just talking about stuff where you don't want to block the ability to change how your unit frame looks a little bit. But it is genuinely, I saw some people saying, well, it's not really about accessibility, it's about making the game too easy. Like, no, it is genuinely an accessibility issue. Like, I'll use myself as an example. Part of the reason that I like to use weak auras is, especially in Classic, I have a really hard time, like my peripheral vision, you might be able to tell I wear glasses. My peripheral vision at like the corners of my screen is not great. I don't really have the ability to reliably notice when I have gotten a debuff, right? Like, especially when it's like just kind of off in the corner and there's so much else that's going on up over there already anyway, it just gets lost and I don't notice that I have received a specific debuff unless it's a part of the fight where I know that I should be looking for it. So unless I'm staring at that corner of the screen, I probably don't notice. So the first boss in Black Fathom Deeps, for example, I ended up putting a weak aura together so that it would pop up with an icon in the middle of my screen instead of just up in the corner that says I have this debuff. Now you might say, well, now that's just playing the game for you. But for me, it was genuinely an accessibility thing. Like, even with the swirly graphic that looked exactly like Evocation, for some reason they used one that looked exactly like a spell that mages were using constantly. Um, it looked like Evocation. I just was not noticing this debuff going out in the middle of combat when I'm trying to do all of my rotation and everything. So especially in melee as well. Like, I was playing a Feral Druid at the time, and it was really hard for me to tell what was going on. So that's why I made this made this weak aura, so that it pops up that icon in the middle of the screen. That was genuinely an accessibility issue for me. If you're someone who has worse vision than I do, you're going to feel that even more. A lot of people who suffer from color blindness need add-ons like this to be able to differentiate between, am I standing in the good thing or the bad thing? A lot of people who have limited hearing need these sort of add-ons to give a visual representation for something that is otherwise a boss call out that's just showing up in the combat log where a whole bunch of stuff is scrolling already anyway. Or sorry, in the chat log where a whole bunch of stuff is scrolling anyway. Like, these are all things that people need to be able to play the game on the same level as someone with perfect vision, perfect hearing, that can see everything happening on their screen all the time and will notice all these things. That's genuinely an accessibility issue. And blocking the ability for add-ons to recognize when something like that is happening is going to result in a lot of people that can no longer play the game at the level that they've been able to play thus far. And you might say that that's a skill thing as well. You might like, oh, well, you're just bad because you don't notice this thing happening up in the top right corner of the screen. That I'm just always going to disagree with. I don't think your ability to notice that the UI is doing something, but it's doing it in a tiny little corner of the screen, I don't think that means you're a skilled player. I think it just means you have better vision than I do. That's literally all that comes down to. There's also been one other thing that I wanted to respond to on this one. I saw a lot of people saying, well, if they banned these add-ons so that they didn't have to do, so they weren't necessary, right? If they banned these add-ons so that wasn't a thing, so that people couldn't use them for accessibility purposes or for, just making the fights less ridiculously tuned, for example, then Blizzard would have to fix the fights. So therefore, if they ban the add-ons, then the game will get better, because then Blizzard will go ahead and fix these things, and they will have to, because the add-ons aren't propping them up. And I understand that line of thinking, but it's backwards. Blizzard can do those things anyway. Like, they don't need to ban the add-ons first to decide that they would like to fix this problem of things being hard to recognize for people with limited vision or limited hearing. They don't need to ban the add-ons to realize that the add-ons are necessary for some of these fights that they're creating. They can just make they can make that change, that philosophical change, and how they're approaching this design. They can make that without banning the add-ons first. And that's something that we have seen them do in the past as well, where they've made improvements to the base UI because they recognize, like Grid, for example, way back in the TBC days. That was when they added in the modern raid frames in World of Warcraft. they added those in because people were using grid and finding that to be such a much better way of seeing your different wow, where did the rest of that sentence go? Seeing your different raid frames and everything. People were seeing it like that, and they're like, this is so much better. So Blizzard basically added a version of that into the base game rather than just banning grid. The same thing happened with CT raid assist way back in the vanilla days, when it used to be the case that if you didn't have CT raid assist, you literally could not see the health bars for the rest of your raid. And so Blizzard added that in as well at that point in time. Like, this is something they've done before. We should be calling for them to make these sort of changes, make these sort of accessibility changes, and make the game easier to read and easier to tell what's going on in this incredibly complicated MMORPG. That's what we should be asking for, not just saying ban the add-ons so that it gets more complicated. Like, that's just kind of backwards to me. Another thing that they can do that they've been doing a little bit more recently is actually actively hiding things from the API a little bit more often, making it so that add-ons can't actually see that this spell is going out. One example that comes to mind where they tried it at the very least was the Among Us fight. I forget the name of the actual encounter. In fact, I don't even remember exactly what. I think it was in Sanctum, but there was the Among Us fight, basically, where when that fight came out, you had to figure out which of your party members that you needed to have everybody DPS, but everyone was attackable, so you had to figure out who it was and attack the imposter in this case. That was something where Blizzard at least tried to block all the information about that from the API and from the UI, so that you had to converse with each other and coordinate with your raid to figure out who the person was and then attack them. Now, as I recall, players and add-on developers ended up figuring out ways to make it an automatic detection anyway, in which case it was a little bit like that experiment wasn't a complete success. But I think stuff like that would be the sort of thing that I would rather see them start leaning towards if they genuinely wanted to make the game harder for people who are using these add-ons. But again, I don't think the solution here is to make the game harder anyway. I think the solution here is incorporate more of these things into the base game, or other ways to make things a little bit more apparent. Like, just real basic stuff. Like, if you get a debuff that is something that you have to react to, I don't see why the game shouldn't do something like the loss of control indicator that they ended up adding for PvP way back in the day, where nowadays, if you get stunned, there's a thing that pops up in the middle of the screen that says you're stunned. And that's how you know that you need to trinket out or whatever, if you decide you want to do that in PvP. Why not add something like that into retail for, you've got the bomb and you need to run away from people? Like, just pop up the icon that's like, you've got the bomb, so that people see that, and doesn't need to tell you what to do with that information. It just needs to surface that information a little bit better. Because with the default UI, trying to notice that in the sea of debuffs, even with the like collapsed thing nowadays, trying to notice that into the sea of buffs and debuffs that's in your upper right of the screen is not really reasonable. And there's enough things that are going out. There's enough things that give you debuffs anyway that aren't related to that. Like, I think there are ways that they could adjust the UI itself to incorporate a lot of this more into the base game, in ways that then the add-on isn't adding much more onto it. Like, I look at this whole thing from, again, largely an accessibility perspective, where the reason that these things exist is because the game's UI itself is not doing very well to surface this knowledge to the player. And yes, there are definitely some where it's like, okay, this is now going to pop up a thing on my screen that tells me exactly what to do in this situation. But again, those are the sorts of things that, like, I don't think players would find necessary as much, if they were getting surfaced the information of what is happening to them in a clearer fashion. Example, again, coming from Season of Discovery, like, outside of that 1 week aura that I just described for Season of Discovery, I haven't used DBM for the entire thing. I haven't used any other sort of combat add-ons, and the other weak auras that I have that I'm using in SOD are mostly to help me keep track of my own buffs and debuffs, because the classic UI really doesn't do a very good job of surfacing that information to the player. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with the whole add-on thing, and that's kind of where I wanted to clarify a little bit more on why I said what I did in last week's episode of In Search of Answers. I really don't think just ban those add-ons is in any way feasible, both technically and logistically. Like, it just isn't something that's going to work. I think the solution here is to, instead of saying, if Blizzard banned these add-ons, that then they would have to fix the game, so Blizzard should ban the add-ons. Like, no, just tell them to fix the game. Like, Go for the change that you actually want. Suggest the change that you actually want to occur. Don't suggest a different change in the hopes that you will get the change that you'll actually want as a like consequence of that first change happening. So anyway, let's move on. Next question / topic for today comes from Neomagam or Neomagam. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this. Hopefully I got one of those right. On YouTube, who says, as someone who plays more in the classic era these days, what changes do you think retail would need to make to help transition? Sorry, let me say that again. What changes do you think retail would need to make to help transition classic players to retail in some dystopian future without new classic expansions or classic plus, besides the gameplay complexity issue that you've discussed in previous episodes? So I have kind of two different ways that I want to answer this question. First, just answering the question directly. If Blizzard were to say, we want to get more classic players to play retail more often, those changes would need to be pretty fundamental and pretty wide reaching, to the point that I don't think they should actually do them. So if you want to get people to play who are playing classic and are in love with classic, especially the like OG vanilla WoW, like classic sort of thing, like the classic era sort of thing, or Season of Discovery, the level 60 World of Warcraft. If you want to get people who are playing that to play retail more often, there are some fundamental philosophical changes about how they develop the game that would need to be made. One is they would need to go back to where the world is more of a character. And I don't mean the world as a character in like the War Within World Soul, sort of like the world is a character, its name is Azeroth, and it's going to talk to you and be a quest NPC sort of way that they're kind of doing. I mean like the world as a character, as in like you go out and explore, and as you're walking around, you're just discovering things and you're finding things, and there's just bits and pieces of stuff sort of littered all around the world, instead of what they've been doing for retail for quite a while now, which is more of a directed narrative experience. It's much more like, here is the story that we're trying to tell with this expansion, and you get to come along for the ride on that story. There are merits and benefits and positives and disadvantages to both aspects of game design, or like both methods. I don't think the retail method is wrong. I just think if they were to want to attract the classic player to retail, that is one of the core things they would need to change, is to make it less about like, here is our story, and you're going to follow along this path of the story that's being told to you as a character that's almost in some ways kind of a bystander to everything else that's going on. Sometimes more central, but a lot of times you just kind of there while a bunch of NPCs do the important stuff. They would need to go back to that sort of sense of like, yeah, there's a world and there's just a bunch of stuff going on, and there isn't necessarily a central narrative thread tying it all together. It's more just, this is Warcraft, this is Azeroth, and here are all these different challenges that are going on. Go and mess around with what you want to mess around with. That would be one big change to make. There's lots of things that could be discussed in terms of like class design and the way that classes fit together. Things like, the sort of maintenance buffs, the like just raid buffs and so on would be things that they would need to consider a little bit more in terms of how that's all coming together. I know they've made some changes along those lines in retail and more recent expansions, but stuff along those lines, there's a lot that could be talked about in terms of like raid design, dungeon design, the way that you gear up and the importance of gear to your character and how gear is designed. Like there's so many changes that would need to be made for retail to become something that's more appropriate to classic, or more what's the word I'm looking for? More attractive to classic players, that I genuinely think, I think that would be a bad idea. I think they would have to change too much about retail to the point that they would risk alienating the retail audience that they have, which is a very strong and very collectively, apparently I'm having trouble with words today. There's a big audience for retail. They would risk alienating that entire audience to make it more palatable to the classic player, which kind of brings me to the second way that I wanted to answer this question, looking at this, which is that even a good idea in the first place? Is trying to attract the classic player to retail a good idea? And I genuinely don't think it is, like much for the same reason that there's probably not much of a reason for them to try to get Overwatch players. Like if you really love Overwatch, now come play World of Warcraft because we've made the game work more like Overwatch. Like that's also like, that sounds dumb as I say it. And I think that's just as dumb as trying to convert retail to play like classic. Blizzard basically at this point has 2 to 4, depending on how you look at it, MMOs. Like they basically have classic WoW and they have retail WoW. And those are very, very different products. And I think what Blizzard has been doing very intelligently, especially with recent things like Season of Discovery, looking at things like the WoW remix, which is probably what I'm going to go into in this week's Sounds Good Makes Sense episode. Looking at the Pandaria WoW remix, looking at things like Cataclysm Classic and all of this stuff that's been going on, but especially looking at SOD. I think they're really looking at this as like, okay, how do we make more content for the classic archetype of player that they want to play? And we don't need to worry about converting them over to playing retail. If you like classic and don't like retail, cool. Here's stuff for you to do in classic. You can just keep playing classic because we have all this classic related content for you. What I'm really hoping to see is that they continue along with things like the sort of Season of Discovery experiment, and they take what they're learning over the next, the remainder of the year, essentially, from Season of Discovery, and figure out how to make that into more content that's going to be exciting and really just sort of motivating for the classic player base, as opposed to trying to figure out how to get them to play retail. Trying to tell a classic player that they should go play retail that's just not going to happen. That's if you're dedicated to classic, like it's possible to like both. For me personally, I'm excited to get into. I mentioned a while back that I'm not really playing Dragonflight right now. That's not because I don't like retail. It's because I'm like there's so much classic stuff to do right now that I'm waiting until the War Within to get back into retail, and I will be getting back into retail with the War Within. But it's possible to like both, but you don't necessarily need to convert people back and forth between the two. So that's kind of the overall thought on where that is. I think trying to do that would be catastrophic. Like it would require too much of a change to retail to the point where they would lose the retail audience in the virtues of trying to get the classic audience to play retail. And it's just a smarter approach for them to do more or less what they've been doing, which is make retail content for retail players, make classic content for classic players, support both player bases independently instead of trying to mix the two together. All right. Next question, and we'll make this the last question for today. This comes from Spa Monkey on YouTube, who says, as a person who was excited enough about the potential release of StarCraft Ghost, who then became an employee of the company, did you ever get to see or play the game internally in whatever state it may have been in? Whatever happened to it? So first thing I'll say, just to reiterate, I'm never going to give like insider information on Blizzard here on the show because that's not what we're here for. And also, I don't want to piss Blizzard off. I'd really rather avoid opening up that can of worms. No matter how great it would be for like short-term YouTube views for me to be like, oh yeah, WoW, former WoW community manager spills all. That would be a very, very dumb decision for me to make just as a human being who doesn't want to piss off a corporation that could sue me into oblivion. And also, like, these are people that I like and I worked with. I don't want to make their lives miserable. That would be dumb of me. It would just be a crappy thing for me to do as a person. So I'm never going to leak information here on my channel. It's just that's a hard no for me. Unfortunately, in this case, there's nothing for me to leak. Like I know what you know about StarCraft Ghost. In fact, I potentially know less than you know about StarCraft Ghost. There was never anything that I saw about it internally at Blizzard whatsoever. And it wasn't something that I particularly went searching for either. I kind of talked about this a little bit last week when with the question related to like canceled projects that I'm most excited about. And part of just the way I am as a person and as a gamer, I tend to like have interest in announced projects, and I tend to sit and be like, oh, I hope that's good when it comes out. But until I can actually play it, I don't really get that excited for things, with some exceptions, and a lot of those have resulted in me being very, very disappointed. See last week's rant about Stray. Where I got really, really excited for this game before it was playable, played it, and was very much let down because it wasn't the game that I was expecting it to be. And StarCraft Ghost kind of falls into that scenario. Titan as well, which eventually became Overwatch, or parts of it at least eventually became Overwatch. That was another game that I never got to see anything internally about of what they were working on there at Blizzard. But I never got to quote unquote play Titan. I never got to play StarCraft Ghost. These are not things that I had access to in any capacity. So there's definitely a lot that I would like to see them continue to, like, I'd love to see them come back to the concept of StarCraft Ghost at some point. It would probably be something that they completely recreate from the ground up. I've heard from people who did get a chance to play it at some point. And this is public knowledge at this point. I'm not leaking anything, but I've heard that people who have played it said that the multiplayer in StarCraft Ghost was actually really good. The bits and pieces, by the way, again, this is stuff that I learned before I even started at Blizzard. because it was canceled well before I started at Blizzard. But like the bits and pieces of stuff that came out over time made it sound almost a little bit like Evolve or Left 4 Dead multiplayer sort of gameplay in StarCraft Ghost. I think that would be I'd love to see a Left 4 Dead that's based around StarCraft. That sounds super cool, where you have one team of like, God, they could even do now I'm just gonna tinfoil hat for a second. They could even do like the three different like races sort of gameplay, where you have one team who you have two teams that are going up against each other, but each team can pick between the three different races. So humans or Terrans, excuse me, Protoss and Zerg. Like, how cool would that be to have a Left 4 Dead style multiplayer where there's the like you're trying to get through, like there's the protagonist sort of trying to get through this mission, and then there's the antagonists who are playing as like the mindless attackers that are like, you know, a Hydralisk or whatever. I don't know. I think that'd be cool. But I never, now I'm completely on a separate tangent because, like I said, I never learned really anything about StarCraft Ghost that wasn't public information already anyway. So unfortunately, I don't have much to share there. But yeah, I think we're going to wrap this up for today, chat. Thank you, chat. Jesus, I've been streamathoning too much. Now I'm just calling everyone chat. I accidentally called my girlfriend chat the other day. That was an experience. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you all so much for hanging out. Again, if you would like to ask a question, you can head over to Patreon, find the form in the posting for this episode on Patreon. If you want to get your priority access to having your question answered, or you can just leave a comment here on YouTube, and I will do my best to get to as many questions as I possibly can. Cool. I'm out of here. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you later.